My name is Claire. I am 40 years old, and I have lived in Asheville, North Carolina, almost my whole life. I own a small bookstore called Turning Page Books, right on Biltmore Avenue, in the heart of downtown. I have been divorced for 3 years, and I am raising my 2 kids mostly on my own. It was on a rainy evening in October of 2015 that my life took a turn I never saw coming. I was closing the store later than usual that night. It had been raining steadily since the afternoon, and Biltmore Avenue was nearly empty. I had already packed up the sidewalk display crates and was just waiting for the rain to ease up before heading home. That was when someone knocked softly on the glass door, careful not to startle me. It was a young woman holding a bouquet of flowers, with a small toddler tucked against her hip, both of them soaked from the rain. She said she was making a delivery, but the address seemed wrong, since the florist shop had given her the number next door by mistake. The little girl in her arms was shivering slightly, and without thinking twice, I opened the door and waved them both inside. Her name was Olivia. She was 20 years old, and her daughter's name was Emma, who was almost 2. While I grabbed a towel to dry the little girl's hair, Olivia kept apologizing over and over, saying she didn't want to bother me, and that she'd leave as soon as the rain calmed down a little. I told her not to worry about it at all. I made some coffee while we waited out the storm, and offered Emma a cookie, which she happily accepted with a big smile. Olivia looked tired, the kind of tired that goes deeper than just the body. I noticed dirt under her fingernails from working with flowers all day, and for some reason that small detail stayed with me. We didn't talk much that first evening, just enough to be polite. She told me she worked delivering flowers for Bloom and Petal Florist, just a few blocks away, and that she'd been doing it since she was 18. I told her I had owned the bookstore for almost 10 years, and that my 2 kids went to school nearby. It was a simple conversation between 2 strangers who happened to cross paths, nothing more than that. At one point, Emma reached her little arms out toward me, and I picked her up without even asking permission. Olivia smiled, a little embarrassed, and said her daughter usually didn't do that with just anyone. I stood there rocking the toddler gently, listening to the rain pound against the awning outside, breathing in the smell of old paperbacks mixed with the flowers Olivia still carried in her arms. That's when Emma looked straight at me and said, in that crooked toddler way, "Pretty." I laughed and thanked her, but I noticed Olivia was watching me with a different kind of expression, one I couldn't quite explain at the time. She looked away quickly, almost like she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't have, and turned her attention back to her daughter. The rain eased up after about 20 minutes, and Olivia said her goodbyes, thanking me again for the coffee and the towel. She said she needed to find the right address before the customer started complaining. I stood in the doorway of the bookstore, watching the 2 of them walk down the street, Emma resting on her mother's hip, the bouquet protected under a makeshift sheet of plastic. I closed up the store that night thinking about nonsense, honestly. I kept replaying the way Olivia had looked at me before glancing away, and I couldn't understand why that small moment had stuck with me so much. I had met plenty of people who passed through my life briefly, customers, acquaintances, people who came and went from the bookstore every single day. But that young woman, 20 years old, with her daughter resting on her hip, wouldn't leave my thoughts. I got home and made dinner for my kids without really paying attention to what I was doing. Tyler asked if I was okay, since I'd been unusually quiet, and I just told him it had been a long day. I didn't tell him that the exhaustion I felt had nothing to do with work. It was a strange, uncomfortable feeling, the kind that comes when you sense something but can't yet name it. That night, before falling asleep, I found myself wondering if I would see Olivia again, and if I did, what exactly I would feel. I had no idea, in that moment, that this brief encounter in the rain was only the first of many to come, and I certainly had no idea how much it was about to change the course of my entire life. In the days that followed that rainy evening, I started noticing Olivia walking down Biltmore Avenue more often than seemed necessary. She worked delivering flowers nearby, so it wasn't strange to run into her once in a while. But suddenly, she was there almost every day, always around the same time, always glancing sideways into my bookstore. I pretended not to notice, but I noticed every single time. One morning, I found a cup of coffee still warm sitting on the counter outside the store, before I'd even arrived to open up. There was no note, no name attached, but I knew exactly who had left it there. I kept that coffee like it was some kind of secret and drank it slowly, sitting on the little stool near the front window. It was the first time I realized that this wasn't a coincidence at all. As the days went on, our encounters started happening more often. One afternoon, I saw Olivia struggling to buckle Emma's car seat into the back of an old beat-up car, fighting with a seatbelt that had jammed. I walked over without really thinking about it, and it took about 10 minutes to finally get that stubborn buckle to cooperate. We ended up laughing about the whole thing, and it felt good. Light, with no weight to it at all. I noticed that when I talked, she paid attention in a different kind of way. The glances between us started lasting a second longer than they should have. I felt something in my stomach, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time, not since long before my marriage fell apart. I tried not to read too much into it, telling myself it was probably just my imagination. One of those days, I scribbled a quote from a book I loved onto a napkin, just because I had nothing better to do while waiting for a customer to leave. I left the napkin near the counter without thinking much of it. Olivia walked by that same afternoon, saw the paper, read it, and tucked it into her jacket pocket without saying a word. I only caught the gesture from a distance, and I found myself wondering what it meant to her. My friend Megan, who runs a shop 2 doors down from mine, started commenting on it. One afternoon, over coffee, she said, half joking, that the flower delivery girl sure seemed to be hanging around my bookstore a lot lately. I laughed it off, of course, pretending it was nothing, but that comment kept nagging at me for the rest of the day. I couldn't tell if she was just teasing or if she'd already picked up on something I hadn't even admitted to myself yet. I was 40 years old with 2 teenage kids. This wasn't supposed to be the kind of thing I was feeling, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. But whenever Olivia showed up on the street, with that tired and sweet look about her, I felt a mix of joy and guilt I couldn't quite explain even to myself. I found myself watching her from a distance, without the courage to admit what was happening. Olivia, on her end, seemed to be feeling something similar. She kept coming up with excuses to walk past the bookstore, claiming it was a shortcut for her deliveries, but I knew that wasn't really the reason. Once, she came in just to ask if I had any cookbooks, and ended up staying almost 20 minutes browsing the shelves without buying a single thing. I watched her wander between the aisles, in no hurry at all to leave. During one of those afternoons, we talked a little more about her life. She told me she'd dropped out of her early childhood education program because of money troubles after Emma was born, and that she'd been working at the florist since she was 18. She said it with a certain heaviness in her voice, like someone used to giving things up. I just listened, not really sure what to say, feeling a strong urge to help somehow. Slowly, I started to understand that what I was feeling wasn't just sympathy or pity. It went deeper than I wanted to admit, and that scared me quite a bit. I had spent 40 years never once doubting who I was, and now, out of nowhere, everything felt different. I couldn't keep pretending I hadn't noticed the way she looked at me. Megan kept making little comments now and then, always half joking, always with that tone of someone just looking out for a friend. I always brushed it off, changed the subject, pretended to be distracted. But deep down, I knew she had picked up on something I myself was still trying to understand, and that left me feeling more and more unsettled. It was on an afternoon with light, drizzling rain, similar to the one from our first encounter, that everything became clearer to me. Olivia and I ended up sheltering under the same awning, waiting for the rain to pass, with nowhere else to go. And it was right there, alone together, that the words we had both been holding back finally started to come out. The rain came out of nowhere, heavy and without warning, and we ran to take shelter under the awning of a closed shop, right near Pack Square. Olivia was still carrying a bouquet wrapped in plastic, trying to protect the flowers from the water. We stood there, side by side, watching the street fill with puddles, not quite sure what to say during that first minute of silence. She was the one who spoke first. She said the heavy rain scared her a little, because it reminded her of a night, almost 3 years earlier, when she'd been stuck outside with nowhere to go. I just listened, not interrupting, sensing right away that this wasn't an ordinary memory. She took a deep breath before continuing. Olivia told me she'd gotten pregnant at 17, during her senior year of high school. Her boyfriend at the time, Jake, disappeared the moment he found out, and she never heard from him again. When her family found out, her father was so furious that he kicked her out of the house for an entire week. She told the story while staring at the ground, without much emotion in her voice, like someone who'd already cried over it so many times that only the bare facts remained. She only managed to go back home because of her grandmother, Ruth. Grandma Ruth kept the news from Olivia's father for a while and was the one who took her in during that week, without asking a single question, without judging her. Olivia said she owed her grandmother her whole life for that. That without her, she didn't know where she would have ended up. I felt a tightness in my chest listening to every word. I sat there thinking about how hard life had been on her at such a young age. I, at 40, had already lived through a whole marriage, had raised 2 kids with a husband by my side, even if that marriage had ended badly. Olivia had faced all of it alone, at 20 years old, with no real support besides her grandmother. That made me admire her in a way I hadn't expected. After hearing her story, I felt like I needed to share something of my own, too. I talked about my marriage, about how Mark had drifted away slowly, years before we officially separated on paper. I told her that after the divorce, I'd decided I wasn't going to open myself up to anyone again, that I was just going to focus on my kids and the bookstore. She stayed quiet, just listening, the same way I had done for her. I also talked about the fear I'd been feeling over the past few weeks, the fear of having feelings I couldn't quite explain. I didn't name it. I couldn't. But I said I'd been confused about some new emotions. Olivia went quiet for a moment, looking at me directly, as if she understood exactly what I meant without needing me to say anything more. The rain kept falling hard, and we stayed there, close to each other, closer than usual. I felt her shoulder almost touching mine, and I didn't pull away. Emma, who'd stayed with Grandma Ruth that day, wasn't there to distract from the conversation, and that made everything feel more intense, fuller of silence between each sentence. At one point, our hands almost touched, when we both reached to adjust the plastic wrap around the bouquet at the same time. We both stared at that moment, at our hands almost meeting, neither of us brave enough to finish the gesture. Olivia pulled her hand back first, a little awkwardly, and I pretended to be adjusting my jacket, just to cover up what had almost happened. I found myself thinking, in that instant, that maybe we were both feeling the same thing. Only neither of us had the courage to say it out loud. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy, full of unspoken things. I knew that if I took the next step, there would be no turning back, and that left me frozen. The rain started easing up slowly, and the moment faded along with it. Olivia said she needed to go, that Grandma Ruth was probably already waiting with Emma. I only managed to say, "Be careful out there," unable to say anything more than that. We looked at each other for one more second before she walked off down the wet street. I went back to the bookstore that afternoon feeling like something had shifted between us, even though nothing concrete had actually happened. I knew that conversation under the awning had opened a door I wasn't going to be able to close again. And I had no idea that the next time we were alone together, everything was going to be very different from that silence full of fear. A few more weeks passed after that afternoon under the awning near Pack Square. Olivia and I kept crossing paths, always quick, always with that mood we both pretended not to notice. Until one Friday came along, and everything changed. My kids had gone to spend the weekend at their dad's place, and Grandma Ruth offered to watch Emma so Olivia could, in her words, take care of a few things. Olivia showed up at the bookstore right around closing time, with no real reason tied to a flower delivery or anything like that. She just said she felt like seeing me. I felt awkward in that moment, but I opened the door and let her in, locking everything up right after. We ended up sitting on the stools near the front window, talking about small, unimportant things. The conversation slowly grew quieter. The glances between us lasted longer than usual, and this time, neither of us looked away. I felt my heart pounding harder, the way it hadn't since long before my marriage ended. Olivia seemed to feel the same way, because her breathing had changed too. She was the one who leaned in first, slowly, almost like she was still asking permission with her body. I didn't pull back. The kiss happened right there, among the bookshelves, gentle and full of hesitation from both sides. It only lasted a few seconds, but it felt like much longer than that. When we pulled apart, we both stood there in silence, not sure what to say after that. I felt a mix of things: happiness, surprise, and then, right after, an overwhelming wave of fear. I immediately thought of a literature professor I had fallen for years earlier, before my marriage had even really fallen apart, and how that had ended in rejection and shame. That memory hit too hard, and I couldn't control it. I stood up from the stool suddenly, saying that shouldn't have happened. Olivia looked at me, confused, not understanding the sudden shift in my mood. I didn't even know how to explain what I was feeling myself. I just knew the fear had taken over everything in a single second. I said a few words that didn't make much sense. Something about being 40 years old, about having kids, about how it wasn't right. Olivia just stood there listening, her eyes already a little teary, without saying anything back. I could see how much my words were hurting her, but I couldn't stop talking, almost like I needed to convince myself in front of her. She slowly stood up and grabbed the bag she'd left near the door. Before leaving, she said one thing quietly: that she didn't know if I'd pulled away out of love or out of shame. I didn't answer, because I didn't know the right answer to give in that moment. I stood there frozen, watching her open the bookstore door and step out into the already dark street. I closed everything up alone after that, feeling an enormous emptiness in my chest. I had done exactly what I'd been afraid of doing, hurting someone who didn't deserve it. I got home that night without any appetite, without wanting to do anything, just thinking about the way Olivia had looked at me before she left. The days that followed were strange. Olivia stopped walking past the bookstore, stopped making up excuses to show up. I felt her absence in a way that scared me, but I kept telling myself I'd done the right thing. Megan noticed I was acting different and asked if something had happened, but I just said I was tired. I spent most of that week avoiding the street where the florist shop was, afraid of running into her. But at the same time, I kept glancing through the front window every time I heard footsteps on the sidewalk, hoping to see Olivia appear. That inner conflict kept growing, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending everything was fine. It was on one of those nights, alone at home after my kids had already gone to sleep, that I realized I couldn't keep going like that. The fear I felt wasn't bigger than how much I already missed Olivia, and it was on that exact night that I made a decision that was about to change everything all over again. That night, after deciding I couldn't keep pretending anymore, I barely slept until almost 2 a.m. The next day, I went straight to Megan's shop before even opening my own bookstore. She noticed right away that something was off, that I was carrying some kind of heavy weight inside. We sat together in the back of her store, near the stockroom, and I finally told her everything. I told her about the kiss, about how I'd pulled away, about the words I'd said to Olivia that night at the bookstore. Megan went quiet for a moment, taking it all in, with an expression I'd never seen on her before. Then she said she supported me, that she was my friend no matter what. But right after that, she said something that stuck with me for the rest of the day. She said in a low voice, "I'm with you, Claire, but have you really thought about what people are going to say?" That left me quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of that question settle in. I knew she hadn't meant it out of cruelty, but I could feel the judgment hiding behind that concern. Still, that one sentence wasn't enough to change my mind. I went back to the bookstore that morning determined to find Olivia. I spent the whole day thinking about how I was going to explain myself, how I was going to undo the damage I'd caused that night of the kiss. I closed the shop early, while it was still daylight, and walked over to Bloom and Petal Florist, where I knew she worked. I found Olivia arranging some vases near the entrance, wearing that blue apron she always wore for work. When she saw me, she froze right there, no expression on her face, waiting to hear what I had to say. I felt nervous, the words catching in my throat. But I managed to start talking anyway. I apologized for everything I'd said that night. I told her I had pulled away out of fear, not out of shame toward her, and not because I thought what I was feeling was wrong. I told her, right there at the florist's entrance, about the literature professor I'd fallen for years earlier, and how that rejection had left a deep mark on me. Olivia listened without interrupting, her eyes growing more and more watery. I told her that what I felt for her was real, that it wasn't some passing phase or confusion. I said I'd spent the whole week trying to convince myself otherwise, and that I hadn't managed to. Olivia stayed quiet for a while after I finished talking, looking at me in a way I couldn't quite read. She asked if I was sure, if I wasn't going to pull away again at the first sign of trouble. I told her I wasn't sure of anything in life, but that I was sure of what I felt right there, in that moment, looking at her. That answer seemed to be enough for her, because I saw her shoulders relax, like a weight had lifted off of them. Olivia stepped closer and took my hand, right there at the florist's entrance, not caring who might be walking by. We stood there in silence for a moment, just feeling that simple gesture. There was no more hesitation like the first time, no fear holding the moment back. She invited me to come in and wait while she finished her shift, and I agreed without thinking twice. We spent that afternoon together, leaning our foreheads against each other every now and then, exchanging quiet words that only mattered to the two of us. It was a nice moment, light, without that heaviness that had marked our first kiss. When we left the florist shop, it was already getting dark. We walked together toward the square, taking our time, talking about simple, everyday things. I felt, for the first time in a long while, a sense of peace mixed with that new emotion that still scared me a little. Olivia seemed to feel the same, because she smiled more than usual. We said goodbye near the square, with a long hug and a quick, discreet kiss, before she headed off to pick up Emma from Grandma Ruth's place. I went home that night with a smile I couldn't hide, even knowing all of it was still going to bring complications. What I didn't know was that those complications were closer than I imagined, and that they were about to come from inside my own house. In the weeks that followed, Olivia and I grew closer, but I still made a point of keeping things discreet, especially around my kids. I texted her throughout the day whenever I had a free moment at the bookstore. The messages weren't anything flashy, but they carried a warmth that anyone reading them closely would have picked up on right away. I never imagined my own daughter would be the one to find them first. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I had left my phone on the kitchen table while I went to take a shower. Sophie, my 14-year-old daughter, picked up the phone to check something and ended up seeing the screen lit up with notifications from Olivia's messages. She didn't grasp the full weight of it right away. She just thought the affectionate wording was sweet. Without any bad intention, she called her brother over to show him. Tyler, 16 years old, read the messages more carefully than his sister had. He understood quickly what was going on, and his reaction was very different from Sophie's. He went quiet for a moment, just staring at the screen, processing what he was reading. When I came out of the shower, I found the two of them in the living room, my phone still in Tyler's hand. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on him before, a mix of anger and disappointment. He asked, point blank, if I was with the woman from those messages. I froze on the spot, not knowing how to respond, feeling my heart race. Sophie just looked back and forth between me and her brother, not fully grasping how big the argument that was starting really was. I tried to explain calmly, asked if we could all sit down together, but Tyler didn't want to hear any of it in that moment. He said I was ashamed of our family, that I was hiding things, that he wasn't going to accept it at all. His words came out with an anger I had never seen in him before, and that hurt more than I expected. Sophie, quieter, just asked if I was happy. That simple question, coming from my younger daughter, caught me completely off guard in the middle of all that tension. I answered yes, that I was happy, even knowing that answer was going to upset her brother even more. Tyler shot back a bitter great and stormed off to his room, slamming the door. I sat there in the living room with Sophie, not really knowing what to say after that. She stayed quiet for a while, just staring at the floor, until she finally asked if I was going to keep seeing Olivia even with her brother so against it. I told her I didn't know, that I needed to understand how she herself was feeling, and that everything was still too recent to be sure of anything. Tyler stayed locked in his room for the rest of the afternoon, refusing to talk to me. I tried knocking on his door a couple of times, but he didn't answer either time. I called Olivia later that evening, half desperate, telling her what had happened. She got worried, asking if I needed anything, if there was any way she could help. I told her no, that I needed to handle this inside my own house, without dragging her directly into it just yet. Olivia understood, but I could hear the sadness in her voice anyway. We stayed on the phone for a long while, just talking, her trying to help me figure out how to handle Tyler's reaction. The next morning, Tyler left the house early, without even having breakfast with me. I got worried and asked Sophie if her brother had said anything to her, and she said no, that he'd just left quietly. That silence made me even more nervous, because I had no idea what he was planning to do with that information. The days that followed were tense at home. Tyler barely spoke to me, answering only when necessary, and I felt like I was losing control of the situation. Sophie, even though she was more open about it, also stayed quiet most of the time, watching everything from a distance. I lived in fear that Tyler might do something I wouldn't be able to undo. It was on one of those afternoons that I found out the reason behind all that silence. Tyler had decided to call his father, Mark, and tell him everything he'd seen in those messages. And it was exactly that phone call, between father and son, that was about to open a door I never imagined would open the way it did. It only took a few days for me to find out what Tyler had done. He had called his father, Mark, and told him everything he'd seen in those messages. Mark called me right after, his voice cold, asking if it was true. I confirmed it, without beating around the bush, and he hung up without saying much more than, "We need to talk about this later." That silence on the other end of the line left me with a bad feeling. Meanwhile, around the neighborhood, things were starting to shift too. People whispered when I walked by, exchanged glances among themselves, murmured when I stepped into shops to run errands. I could feel it in the air, even though no one said anything directly to me. It felt like everyone already knew, even though I'd barely told anyone myself. Olivia was feeling the same thing on her end. Some customers at the florist shop made cruel comments, saying she was taking advantage of my financial stability. Others said she'd changed too fast to suddenly like women, implying things that had nothing to do with reality. She'd come home at night and tell me all of it, her voice tired from hearing so much nonsense. It was at a church gathering the following weekend that things got even harder. I'd only gone because my sister Helen had insisted I show up. In the middle of the service, Pastor Daniel gave a sermon about family, and at one point he mentioned broken families losing sight of their values. He didn't say my name, but he looked straight in my direction while he said it, and plenty of people noticed that look. I felt my face burning with embarrassment right there, in front of everyone I'd known since childhood. Some people looked away from me right away, Others stared openly, waiting to see how I'd react. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, with that enormous tightness in my throat, counting the minutes until the sermon ended. It was one of the hardest public humiliations I'd ever gone through. I left before the service even ended, without saying goodbye to almost anyone, and went straight to Olivia's place. I told her everything that had happened, and she held me tightly, without needing to say a word. I cried for a long while in her arms, feeling the weight of everything that had been building up over the past few weeks. That hug was the only place I felt safe in that moment. It didn't take long for things to get even worse. A few days after the church gathering, a video of us hugging near Pack Square showed up in a neighborhood social media group. Someone had filmed it from a distance, without us noticing, and posted it with a nasty comment underneath. The video spread fast, talked about by people I barely even knew. I started getting messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, asking if it was true, if I had really turned out that way. Some came with a tone of curiosity, others with outright judgment. I deleted most of them without responding, with no energy left to explain my life to every single person who asked. Olivia got heavy comments in that group too, mostly about the age gap between us. People said she was 20 years old, selling herself for an older woman's stability. Awful words that cut deep. She tried to act like it didn't bother her, but I could see how much it was weighing on her underneath. At home, Tyler used all the buzz to push his stance against the relationship even harder. He said everyone was talking about it, that he was embarrassed to walk down the street because of it. Sophie, on the other hand, grew quieter, and one night she asked me softly if I was okay with everything people were saying. I told her it was hard, but that I wasn't going to give up on what I felt because of gossip. My sister Helen pulled me aside that same week, saying she completely disagreed with my choice. She said it was going to bring shame on the whole family, and that maybe it would be better if we kept some distance until things calmed down. That conversation left me devastated, because I never expected to hear that kind of thing from my own sister. In those days, I felt like the whole world was against us, between the neighborhood gossip, the humiliation at church, the viral video, and my own son's stance. Olivia and I saw each other less and less, both of us exhausted from facing so much pressure on top of everything else in life. And it was right in that moment of weakness that I found out someone close to me had done something that was about to put everything at even greater risk. The person who had done that was Megan. I found out from another shop owner on the street that she'd mentioned my relationship with Olivia during a conversation with some of the other moms from my kids' school, before I was even ready to tell that group myself. She said she'd told them out of concern, thinking she was somehow helping me. But the result was that even more people ended up talking about me than I ever imagined. I called Megan as soon as I found out, feeling a mix of anger and disappointment. She tried to explain herself, saying it had slipped out by accident, in the middle of a conversation that had gotten away from her. I told her that wasn't something to go around sharing, that she had broken a trust I'd had in her for years. I hung up the phone without letting her finish her apology. That betrayal made me realize I couldn't keep holding everything in the way I'd been doing. I went to find Olivia at the florist shop, determined to finally talk through everything, without holding anything back anymore. I found her wrapping up her shift, with that tired look that had become familiar over the past few weeks. I asked if we could sit down for a bit, right there in the back of the shop. I started by telling her about Megan, about the betrayal, about how exposed it had left me without even wanting it. Olivia listened carefully, not interrupting, letting me get everything out first. When I finished, she took a deep breath and said she also needed to say a few things she'd been holding on to for a while. She told me she was afraid of never being seen as old enough by the people around her. She said she felt like everyone looked at her as the girl who took advantage of a situation, never as someone capable of really loving someone. That hit me hard, because I knew part of that judgment came from exactly the kind of comments I'd been hearing myself over the past few weeks. I told her the fear I felt was different, but just as heavy. I talked about the fear of being seen as someone robbing her of her youth, of being called a predator by people my own age. I told her every comment I heard about it made me question whether I was being fair to her, dragging her into all this judgment. We sat in silence for a while after that, letting those words settle between us. Olivia broke the silence first, asking if I wanted to give up because of all of it. I told her no, that the fear I felt wasn't bigger than what I felt for her, but that I needed to know if she was also willing to keep facing all of it alongside me. She said yes, without hesitating, and squeezed my hand tightly. She said she'd already faced worse things on her own, and that facing this with me, at least, wouldn't be lonely. That sentence gave me an enormous sense of relief, because up until that moment, I hadn't known if she still had the strength to keep standing by me after so much pressure. We decided right then, that afternoon, that we weren't going to keep hiding the way we had been. We agreed we'd face the comments, the gossip, the sideways looks, without pulling away from each other out of fear of what people might think. It was a simple agreement, but it carried an enormous weight, because we both knew exactly how hard the road ahead was going to be. We left the florist shop holding hands, not caring who saw us on the street. It was the first time we let ourselves do that in public, without that fear holding back every movement. Some people stared, of course, but for the first time, it didn't bother me nearly as much as before. I went home that night, determined to talk to my kids more seriously than I had before. I knew Tyler was still resistant, and that Sophie, even though more open, still had her own doubts. But I felt like it was time to face it head on, without any more excuses to put it off. What I didn't expect was that, right when I had decided to settle things at home, someone else from Olivia's past was about to show up and complicate everything in a way neither of us had seen coming. That week, I decided to set up a dinner at home so I could finally have a real conversation with Tyler and Sophie. I invited Olivia to come too, this time officially, without hiding anything anymore. She agreed, even though she was nervous, knowing how difficult that meeting could turn out to be. I cooked that evening with my hands shaking a little, not knowing exactly how the night was going to end. Olivia arrived right on time, without Emma, since we'd agreed it would be better to keep that first meeting just between the adults and my kids. Tyler, when he saw her in the living room, had that same closed-off expression that had become familiar over the past few weeks. Sophie, on the other hand, was friendlier, helping set the table and even exchanging a few words with Olivia while I finished cooking. The four of us sat down at the table, and the mood was heavy at first, with barely any conversation in those first few minutes. I tried starting with small talk, but the silence kept creeping back in whenever I stopped speaking. Tyler picked at his food without much appetite, avoiding eye contact with Olivia the whole time. Sophie, every now and then, asked some small question just to fill that uncomfortable emptiness. At one point, I decided to stop pretending everything was normal. I spoke openly about what I felt for Olivia, about how it wasn't some passing phase or some kind of foolishness. I said I understood their discomfort, but that I needed them to at least try to get to know her for real before judging everything. Tyler stayed quiet, but this time he didn't leave the table. Sophie was the first to say something after that. She said, in a soft voice, that she just wanted to see me happy, and that she'd noticed how much more I'd been smiling since Olivia came into our lives. That simple statement moved me deeply, because it came from a sincere place, with no judgment behind it at all. Olivia thanked her, eyes already a little teary, unable to hide her emotion. Tyler, after hearing his sister, finally said something too. He said he still couldn't really accept it, that he still felt embarrassed by the comments he'd been hearing at school and around the neighborhood. But he admitted, in a lower voice, that he'd noticed I seemed lighter lately, even with all the chaos around us. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was more than I'd expected to get that night. Olivia tried to reach out to him, saying she understood his discomfort, that she didn't expect to be accepted overnight. She said she just wanted a chance to show him who she really was, without rushing anything. Tyler didn't say much back, just shrugged, but at least he didn't leave the table or raise his voice that time. The dinner ended in a mood that was still a little awkward, but very different from the tension that had started the night. Sophie helped clear the plates alongside Olivia, chatting about small, almost normal things. Tyler stayed quieter, but he watched the two of them in a different way, maybe weighing it all inside himself, without saying out loud what he was thinking. Before leaving, Olivia said goodbye to each of them carefully. Sophie even gave her a quick, slightly awkward but genuine hug. Tyler just gave a small nod, not coming any closer, but also without showing the hostility he'd displayed in previous weeks. That small gesture already felt like enormous progress after everything we'd been through. When Olivia left, I stayed in the living room talking a little more with my two kids. Sophie said she felt like, with time, her brother would get used to the idea. Tyler, listening from the hallway, didn't say anything, but he didn't argue either. That silence of his, this time, felt less hostile than usual. I went to bed that night with a strange sense of relief, mixed with exhaustion. I knew Tyler's acceptance was still far from complete, and that a lot still needed to be worked out at home, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe we could get somewhere good, even if it was slow going. What I didn't know was that, while I was trying to rebuild bridges inside my own home, my ex-husband Mark was already, at that very moment, taking the first steps to use all of it against me, in a way that was about to put the most important thing in my life at risk: my own kids. I got the call from Mark on a Tuesday morning, still inside the bookstore, before I'd even opened up for customers. He said in a flat voice that he'd filed a petition in court to revisit custody of our kids. He said the environment I was raising Tyler and Sophie in wasn't healthy anymore, using my relationship with Olivia directly as his argument. I froze, feeling the phone nearly slip out of my hand. I called a lawyer I knew that same morning, desperate to understand what this actually meant. She explained that cases like this could take months to resolve, and that I needed to prepare myself emotionally for some tough questions, maybe even a hearing. I felt the ground give way beneath me, thinking about the possibility of losing day-to-day time with my own kids. I told Olivia as soon as I gathered the courage to call her. She went quiet for a moment, and then said she felt like this was, in part, her fault, for coming into my life and bringing all this complication with her. I told her not to think that way, that no one was at fault for loving someone, and that the real problem was with people who insisted on judging. When Tyler found out about his father's petition, he seemed visibly torn. On one hand, he still carried some resentment over the whole situation. On the other, he seemed to realize this custody request went far beyond a simple disagreement. Sophie got scared at the idea of having to live with her dad, away from me. And that, in a strange way, made her grow even closer to me in the days that followed. I talked to both of them about what was happening, without hiding how serious the situation was. I told them that whatever got decided, I was going to keep fighting to stay close to them, the same way I always had. Tyler, for the first time in weeks, hugged me without me having to ask. A brief but sincere hug, like someone finally understanding that this was bigger than his own grudges. Olivia offered to help me in every way she could, even knowing her presence in my life was being used against me in the case. She said she wasn't going to back away out of fear, that she'd already faced enough judgment in her life to give up now. That steadiness from her gave me strength in a moment when I felt like I was about to fall apart. Megan, hearing about the case, came by the bookstore to apologize for real, for her earlier betrayal. She said she felt guilty for somehow contributing to spreading the gossip that had eventually reached Mark's ears. I couldn't fully forgive her in that moment, but I accepted the apology, knowing I needed allies, not more enemies during such a hard time. In the weeks that followed, I gathered documents, witnesses, proof that my kids had always been well cared for, regardless of any relationship I had. The lawyer said the case had good odds, but that nothing was guaranteed until the final decision. I lived between moments of hope and moments of deep fear, barely able to rest properly for days. Olivia stayed by my side through every one of those moments, holding my hand on the hardest nights, never asking for anything in return. Emma, even though she was little, seemed to sense the heavy mood between the adults and clung to her mother more than usual. Grandma Ruth, hearing about everything, sent word through Olivia that she was praying for me and for my kids. Tyler and Sophie started saying openly that they wanted to keep living with me, even with all the chaos of the past few months. That, in some way, strengthened my case, but it also weighed on my heart, knowing how much they were being exposed to a fight that had never been their choice. I promised myself that, no matter what happened, I was going to protect them however I could. The hearing date got set for a few weeks out, and the tension at home only grew as the day got closer. Olivia and I stood firm, more united than ever, but aware that the outcome of that case could change everything in a way neither of us could control. We held each other's hands every night, not knowing exactly what the future held. On the night before the hearing, sitting together in my living room, after my kids had already gone to bed, Olivia asked if I was scared about what might happen the next day. I said yes, very scared, but that I wouldn't trade anything we'd lived through for anything, not even if I could go back in time. We stayed there in silence, hands intertwined, waiting for the morning to bring the answer that would decide the next chapters of our story.